The Falcons 2024 schedule has been announced. Did the NFL do them any favors?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons schedule. Locked On Falcons podcast. We are Locked On Falcons schedule. It is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. So, guys, if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. the Iron that Sharpens the Iron, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. been covering the Falcons for far too long. Formerly at falcfans.com, RIP. Still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And I thank each and every one of you that is an everydayer of this pod that makes it your first listen, first watch of the day. All you got to do to become an everydayer subscriber, follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today we are breaking down the Falcons 2024 schedule that has just released an hour ago. We'll go week by week. We're not going to do record predictions or anything like that. We'll look at some key matchups. We'll look at some interesting narratives that I've been thinking about. I've been thinking about the Falcons schedule since like February. And now that we know the exact order, we can sort of put all of these thoughts in a row. But, not going to do a record prediction, but in general, I've kind of felt like the Falcons, based off of the offseason moves that they made, they feel like a 9-8 team, right? And I don't think the schedule at first glance did them too many favors to make me feel like they're going to enhance that to get them to, maybe they get to 10 wins, but 11, 12 wins. I think their ceiling probably is like a 12-win team this year, looking at the schedule. I think their floor is probably like a 6-win team. And me, I love to split the difference between the floor and the ceiling, that eye level, and get you to 9 wins. And I think whether or not this team can raise their ceiling to be more than a 9-win team, a lot of that depends on this passing game, right? And, the potential for this passing game with the upgrade made at the quarterback position, obviously has increased the potential of this football team. Now, there's a lot of talk you see various things that say, the Falcons have the easiest schedule in 2024 based off of 2023 win percentage, right? And we know that can be a little misleading because, there are teams that always exceed expectations and underachieve expectations. Like last year you had, nobody really thought the Texans and Rams would be good. They wound up being playoff teams. Most people thought the Jets would be good. They wound up being anything but that, But if you head on over to FanDuel, right, proud sponsor of, the Locked On Podcast Network, and they also indicate that the Falcons have one of the weakest schedules because 14 of their 17 games this year are played against teams that are in the bottom half of the league in terms of Super Bowl odds. And we tend to put a little bit more stock into Super Bowl odds made by, sports books like America's number one sportsbook, FanDuel, just because it's more reflective of what these teams look like today as opposed to what they were at the end of last season, right? And again, that's still not accurate, but it's probably a little bit more accurate than last year's records. And, if you're curious, the Falcons have the 12th best Super Bowl odds, but, again, they have 14 games, including all 6 division games against teams that are in the bottom half of the league in terms of Super Bowl odds. Now, you look at over-under win totals. Again, the Falcons also have the weakest schedule this year, right? Their average opponent this year, based off of those over-under win totals at FanDuel, America's number one sportsbook, is like 7.6 wins, right? So on average, they're facing, a below average team every single week, right? 8 of those games that they have this year are against teams that are basically projected with their over under win totals are 7.5 or 8.5, right? They have 3 games against top opponents. That's going to be Dallas, Philadelphia, and Kansas City. And then they have 6 games against bottom opponents, right? And, I'm sure opinions will vary, but like I look at those top 3 opponents and I'm like, I don't feel good about the Falcons winning any of those games. And then I look at the bottom 6 teams like the Giants and the Panthers and the Raiders and those teams like that, right? Broncos. Like, I don't expect the Falcons to sweep those teams and sweep those games, right? A couple of division games. The Falcons are notorious for losing a game they have no business losing, right? Last year that was like the Arizona game, and This year that could be the Broncos game or something like that. So you're probably going like 4-2 in those games. And so if you're looking at the top three against the toughest three opponents and the bottom 6 games against the bottom 6 opponents, like you're potentially like 4-5 at that point in time. And so from my perspective, those 8 games in the middle where you're facing teams that are projected to win 7.5 wins or 8.5 wins, teams like Pittsburgh, the Chargers, Tampa Bay, New Orleans, you kind of have to go 5-3 at least, right? If you're going to try to get to 9 wins this year, right? Possibly 6-2. So the Falcons have to kind of dominate the middle tier of the NFL this year if they want to have a playoff wins. And that's not going to be a situation where they're going to blow out those teams, 31-17 in all likelihood. Those are going to be games that they're going to have to win close games, probably in the fourth quarter. We're going to be sitting here with our heart palpitations with, 3 minutes left in the fourth quarter of a lot of those games. And they're going to have to find ways to win those games. And we'll see if this team is capable of that. But one of the things you've heard me talk about, for the last several days and weeks this offseason, and part of my disappointment with, the Falcons not being a little bit more proactive, trying to upgrade areas of the roster, is I've made the comments that the Falcons are making a lot of the same bets that they made last year. And a lot of people have pushed back on that. It's like, they're making a bet on Kirk Cousins. That's very different than making a bet on Desmond Ridder, which is fair. But I think a big part that people aren't realizing is the Falcons are similar to last year, right? Everybody talks about, they bet on Desmond Ridder. It was a terrible bet. But the real bet the Falcons were making was they were betting on their run game. And that's why they were like, we're willing to bet on Desmond Ridder because we think this run game is going to be elite and be able to carry our offense. And I think, contrary to probably popular opinion, I think the Falcons are making a similar bet, not to the same degree that they were, where, they're going to run the ball 550 times or 600 times if Arthur Smith had his druthers last year. But you're probably going to see a team that's going to lean heavily on the run game. They're probably going to, if things go according to plan, they're going to be, running the ball close to 500 times this year, right? Because you're not going to ask Kirk Cousins at his age, coming off his injury, to drop back and throw the ball 40 times. Like, that's arguably part of the reason why he's in this position, because last year, before his injury, he was leading the league in pass attempts. The year before, he was top 3 in terms of overall dropbacks. And a lot of those guys that had 650, 700 dropbacks last year got hurt again. Justin Herbert, Kirk Cousins, Joe Burrow last year. And so, I don't think the Falcons could be asking Kirk Cousins to sort of carry the offense and drop back 40 times and win. Now, the hope is that, unlike last year, where the Falcons, I think in the 3 games where they had asked Desmond Ridder to drop back 40 times, they lost all 3 of those games. Hopefully, if the Falcons are forced to have to, ask Kirk Cousins to drop back and throw the ball 40 times in order for them to win, they'll be in a better position to win those types of games. But when we look at the schedule, and we're about to break it down in a second, we'll go week by week on it. But early on in the season, I really do think the run game and the offensive line are going to have to hit the ground running, because we've talked before about Kirk Cousins' tendency historically to start slow, right? We can't have the offensive line and running game that's going to need to be that sort of foundation if and when Kirk Cousins starts slow this year, right? You can't have the ups and downs like we had at the beginning of last year, where it was like 1 week's run game looked good, the next week they looked terrible, right? Kirk Cousins' all-time career winning percentage in the month of September is 36%, right? In October and November, things get better. He wins about 61% of the games that he starts in those 2 months. And so I think the Falcons schedule sets up where a slow start is potentially expected. And it's, the Falcons have no time to waste. They got to kind of hit the ground running, given how this schedule is going to set up. And that's why we talk about the tremendous content that's coming your way, because if the Falcons hit the ground running and start fast, then, we're going to be talking about this team as the darling of the NFL in the month of September. If they start slow, there's going to be other narratives where people are going to be ready to bury this team by the time we get to October. But we'll go week by week, look at these matchups and break down some, interesting narratives, right? Some compelling storylines that, when we have this tremendous content here on this everyday podcast this year, we'll get into all of that, guys, as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So now that the schedule has dropped, there's lots of intrigue involving the Falcons schedule, and our friends at Gametime are going to help you take the guesswork out of buying tickets for these upcoming NFL games, because they have the killer last minute deals, all in prices and views from your seat. It's easy to find and buy tickets for NFL games, or, tickets for any event in your area. My favorite feature of Gametime is the seat view, right? You can preview what it's going to look like for your event, before you buy. So if you happen to go to that week 1 Steelers game, you get to see, you can position yourself perfectly to see Arthur Smith's reactions in the booth as, he's firing things up or whatever, knocking over drinks or whatever he's doing out there. So go, to Gametime, download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL. That's LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download the Gametime app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. So, guys, if you want to get the lowdown on the biggest stories in sports, and the schedule list is one of those, check out Locked On Sports today for free 24/7 streaming channel here on YouTube, or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So let's break down these first half of the season. We'll go through weeks 1 through 9. Week 1, of course, if you guys don't know, is September 8th, a 1 o'clock kickoff at home against the Pittsburgh Steelers. I think one of the key matchups in this game is going to be the Falcons offensive tackles going up against TJ Watt and Alex Highsmith. The offensive line, again, needs to step up early, and they'll be facing one of the best pair of edge rushers in the NFL. And so if the Falcons want to protect Kirk Cousins, they need to block those guys. And many of the narratives, you got this, it's great setup for the NFL, right? You got the Steelers, who did the cheap thing that a lot of Falcon fans were pushing for, going for Russell Wilson and Justin Fields, and Falcons went expensive at the quarterback position. Who wins that game will determine whether or not which team should have done the other thing, right? You got the new versus old Falcons play callers, right? Zach Robinson versus Arthur Smith, right? You have the Raheem Morris, Mike Tomlin, like the kind of the student versus the master. Like Raheem Morris got to start in Tampa Bay, coaching under Mike Tomlin in the secondary back in the Bucs back in the day. They're friends that go back, many, many years. So can the student usurp the master, in Raheem being the student and Tomlin being the master? So that's going to be something. Obviously, Mike Tomlin is undefeated, I think 4-0 in his career against the Falcons. So, can Raheem get that to 4-1, right? Then week 2, Monday Night Football. Falcons have 4 primetime games. No, I'm sorry. Yes. What am I talking about? 4 primetime games. Thursday night sometimes doesn't count in my brain. But, week 2, their first primetime game is a Monday night game against the Philadelphia Eagles on the road. Like all Eagles games and the Falcons is always about the trenches on both sides of the ball, right? The offensive line now it's going to continue to step up. The Eagles are no slouches at the edge, but you have, a tough interior with Jordan Davis, Jalen Carter, right? Can the Falcons pass rush get home against one of the best O-lines in football, right? And now you're hoping, we'll see what the Falcons edge rushers do this year, but I don't expect anybody to be the caliber of pass rusher that can really, do damage against Lane Johnson and Jordan Mailata. So that's going to be a game where you're probably going to need Grady Jarrett and David Onyemata to take advantage of what could be a weaker Eagles interior offensive line with 2 new starters at center and right guard. And, of course, the great narrative for this game is the Bijan Jalen Carter rehash, right? Like, can the Falcons, Matthew Bergeron or whoever, block Jalen Carter? Is Bijan going to go off? Like, can he take advantage of a relatively weak Eagles linebacker core? Right. I know they got Devin White, but, the rest of that group, like, there's some matchups that the Falcons can maybe exploit. And so we can have that conversation about, who the Falcons could have picked, because I know so many people love to have that conversation. Then week 3, you got another primetime game, Sunday Night Football at home against the Kansas City Chiefs. Key matchup. It's like, you want to beat the Chiefs, you got to pressure Patrick Mahomes, right? And can the Falcons edge rushers, exploit what is a weak, relatively weak Chiefs tackle position, right? We know the Chiefs added more speed at the position. Do we get a bounce back year for the GOAT, right? The Chiefs won most of their games last year 20-17, right? Are they going to be the type of offense again this year that can put up, 30 points on a regular basis, right? Like I looked up the stat, right? The Falcons had 2 games last year where they scored 28 or more points. The Chiefs had 3. So like their offense was better than the Falcons, but in terms of putting up, big points, they weren't necessarily doing that. And then one of the fun narratives from that game is like, you got the tight end duel, right? Travis Kelce, the old guy, Kyle Pitts, the young guy, right? Like the Chiefs know how to get this guy, arguably the greatest tight end of all times, him the football. Do the Falcons now have figured out how to get Kyle Pitts the ball? Do we have a game where Travis Kelce has like 7 catches for 109 yards and Kyle Pitts has 8 catches for 139 yards or something like that? That would be a great, fun matchup. But week 4, you get a home game again against the Saints. And that first 3 stretch, right? Like, there's a possibility where the Falcons start this season 1-2 or 0-3 or something like that. And so this week 4 game kind of is a must-win game at home against the Saints, right? September 29th, 1 o'clock kickoff, right? Many potential matchups in this game, but, which team's pass rush is going to get home? The Saints added Chase Young, right? Does that upgrade their pass rush? The Falcons added a bunch of rookies. Does that upgrade their pass rush? Saints have potentially three new starters on their offensive line this year, including potentially a rookie left tackle, if I'm not mistaken. Can the Falcons take advantage of it? And then you have, some interesting narratives where both teams have new offensive coordinators, right? Falcons have Zach Robinson. Saints have Clint Kubiak. Clint Kubiak's a Kyle Shanahan disciple. Robinson's a McVay disciple, sort of that battle, McVay versus Shanahan, and which veteran quarterback at this point in time, by the time we get to the end of September, has already started to get the groove of this new offense. That's going to be an interesting narrative. Now, week 5, you have a short week starting off October, Thursday night football at home against the Bucs. We saw Drake London in terms of key matchups. Drake London, really had the best game of his career last year against the Bucs in week 14. But unfortunately, the Falcons lost that game because the quarterback couldn't stop putting the ball in harm's way that week, along with other issues. And so now hopefully the quarterback will stop putting the ball in harm's way, and Drake London will have another big game going up against, a weakened Bucs secondary because they lost Carlton Davis, right? They couldn't cover Drake London with Carlton Davis. Can they cover him without him, right? And then you have, an interesting narrative coming back-to-back NFC South games, right? You kind of need to win that Saints game. You kind of need to win that Bucs game. If you're the team to beat in the NFC South, you got 2 division games to start this thing, one against the defending champs. So you're battling out for that throne, the champs versus the usurper for the NFC South supremacy. You got 2 McVay disciples and Zach Robinson and Liam Cohen calling plays for both teams. Who are we looking at as the next Zach Taylor? Who's going to be the guy that's starting to build that future head coach resume? Because we know so many of these guys have that. And so you have that situation with Clint Kubiak and now Liam Cohen, Zach Robinson. Week 6, another NFC South game, right? In October, a 4 o'clock kickoff on the road against Carolina, right? Key matchup. Is this going to be the year that we finally are able to block Derek Brown, right? How much improvement is Matthew Bergeron going to make? Is Chris Lindstrom going to sort of get back to that all-pro level, right? We've had a bunch of these matchups. The offensive line, again, it's going to have to get the ball rolling because each one of these games features guys that have the potential to give them problems. So we'll see if the Falcons can make it 3 division wins in a row. Then they go back home in week 7, October 20th, against Seattle. And Seattle is one of these sort of mid-tier teams that we're talking about, these teams that are expect to win like 7 or 8 games this year, right? Can the Falcons win that game like they need to? Key matchup. That trio of wide receivers, right? Ryan Grubb, the offensive coordinator at Washington, Michael Penix's OC last year. They had that vertical stretch offense in Washington with 3 really good NFL caliber receivers. Seattle has 3 really good, obviously NFL caliber receivers in DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, and Jackson Smith and Jigba. Is Ryan Grubb going to get that Washington magic and make that offense go to the next level? So that's going to be whether or not the Falcons have the horses on the back end in the secondary to be able to match up with the trio of receivers, especially if they're, cooking like that Washington offense was. And then, of course, some of the narratives, you got 2 new coaches in Raheem Morris versus Mike McDonald. Which team is looking good at that point? That's going to be interesting. Week 8, another NFC South game on the road against Tampa Bay to close out October. Mike Evans, right? He's been a thorn in our side for, over a decade, 11 years now. Are we going to finally be able to lock him down? Like maybe just one time before he retires. I know he's got a couple more years left on his contract, like 2 more years left on his contract. Like maybe we can shut him down one time, maybe. Right. And again, you have the same sort of narrative about, if the Falcons are going to be the NFC South champs, right? You got to beat the champs to be the champs, right? And then week 9, to start November, Dallas at home. Key matchup. Can we block Micah Parsons, right? Like you're not going to leave Caleb McGarry on an island against Micah Parsons. Like you're just you're daring Kirk Cousins to get hurt. Right? So you're going to have to chip him every snap. And we'll talk about this later, when we talk about the Raiders matchup, but as well. But, it's a similar conversation there with Micah Parsons as we have with Max Crosby, where you're going to have to chip him every snap. And if you're using your tight ends to chip every snap, right? Like if you're playing 12 personnel, let's say you're putting Charlie Warner on the field and you're asking Charlie Warner to chip every snap. Well, if you're playing 12, that's one less receiver, right? Or if you're playing 11 personnel, then you're asking Kyle Pitts to kind of chip him, and then therefore, like, who's gonna, you're not asking Kyle Pitts to be a major factor in the passing game. Although I guess you can chip him and then he can kind of release, and you can just kind of feed him 5 and 6 yard passes and hope that he can eat that way. But like, if you Kyle Pitts is not going to be a featured part of that game plan because he's going to have to stay in and chip Micah Parsons, then you need the rest of your receivers to kind of step up. And so I'm looking at these first 9 games, and like the schedule gets easier in the back half, right? There's a lot more winnable games in the back half. Like you're not really dealing with any juggernauts. Your 3 hardest opponents you're getting in the first 9 games in Philly, KC, and Dallas, right? You're getting several of these sort of mid-tier teams, including 4 in the division, Pittsburgh, Seattle as well. So it'll be interesting to see if the Falcons are sitting at this point, week 9, above 500, things are going great for this team. But like, this is going to be the tough stretch of the season. They're going to have to kind of, if they get off to a slow start in September, they're definitely going to have to hit their stride in October if they want to make up ground, because, as the schedule does get easier, I don't know if you can always count on, hey, we're just going to run the table in the back. If we're, let's say, 3-6 or something like that, we'll win 7 of our next, 8 games in order to guarantee a playoff spot. That's going to be hard to do. So the better the Falcons perform in the first half of the season, the better they will set themselves up for success, where again, you want to see them take care of business, but you don't want to necessarily have to have a situation where we're going into their week 12 bye and coming out of the week 12 bye where they have to win like 5 out of the last 6 in order to have a real shot at making the playoffs. But we'll break that all down, guys, as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So, guys, with the schedule coming out, don't forget, it is winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and Major League Baseball season is going strong, and FanDuel is going to give you a shot to bring home that big win of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to use on spreads, money lines, prayer props, and so much more. And of course, now that the schedule is released, go on over to FanDuel, check out the Falcons over/under win totals, 9.5 wins. Their Super Bowl odds, Raheem being coach of the year, Kirk being MVP. Check out the NBA draft props with the Atlanta Hawks holding the number 1 pick. It looks like Alex Sarr still remains the front runner to be that pick, but go check it out at FanDuel.com/lockedon. Make every bet and every playoff shot count. FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook. So, wrapping up today's episode, let's look at the second half of the Falcon season. These last 8 games, starting out week 10 on the road against the Saints. Chris Olave is probably the key matchup, right? And one thing that we haven't really talked about is, are the Falcons going to ask AJ Terrell to shadow this year, right? And you look at recent matchups, right? Chris Olave gave, this Falcons secondary a lot of problems. The other Saints receivers, all, Jeff Okudah and Clark Phillips did not look great in those 2 Saints matchups last year, right? And who knows who's going to be the number 2 cornerback this year? I think maybe next week talk about that. We'll see. But you look at those 2 Saints games, and I know AJ gave up a back shoulder touchdown to A.T. Perry in that week 18 matchup, but he didn't have a single targeted man coverage in that game, right? Whenever the Falcons with the man coverage, they didn't throw at AJ Terrell's way. And so if you're the Falcons, and I look at that and I would go like, okay, well, if we want to take Chris Olave out of the game, we'll just put AJ Terrell in man coverage against him, right? We'll just have him shadow him, and hopefully that will take him out of the game, and that will force, the A.T. Perrys and the Rashid Shaheeds to have to win the game. And hopefully our wide receivers will be better prepared to deal with those types of guys. So that's going to be sort of a key matchup that may determine that week 10 game, right? The week 11 game in November 17th, 4:00 kickoff, is on the road against Denver. And to me, like, the key matchup in this game, or at least the funnest matchup to me, is going to be Drake London versus Patrick Surtain, right? The Broncos do ask Surtain to shadow. And it basically, one of the things we've talked about on this podcast is like this Falcons passing game, a lot of it's going to be driven by Drake London potentially this year, right? That he's going to be the Puka Nacua. He's going to be the Cooper Kupp in this offense that's going to get, 10 plus targets every single week. And basically the Broncos game plan, if that is the case, the Broncos game plan is like, okay, well, we're going to put Patrick Surtain on him. And instead of getting 10 targets, he's going to take away, he's only going to get 5 targets. And then that now means Darnell Mooney and the rest of this receiver core are going to have to pick up the slack, so to speak. And of course, the narrative is, of course, like Sean Payton, right? We all hate him, so let's get another win against them. But I was talking to Adnan Ikic over at the Falcoholic earlier, and he was talking about potential trap games, and this Broncos game sandwiched between a tough road game against the Saints and then the bye week, could be a trap game similar to kind of last year's Cardinals game where it was like right before the bye and everybody was like, oh, they're a cupcake team, and we'll see. So Denver is going to be an interesting matchup there. The Week 12 game, November 24th, so that's Thanksgiving weekend, will be a bye, so you guys can enjoy your family time and not have to worry about the Falcons adding more stress to you that weekend. The following week in Week 13, December 1st, is a 1 o'clock home game against the Chargers. Key matchup, I think, is going to be the battle in the trenches. We know that Jim Harbaugh is going to build a team that's going to want to punch teams in the mouth, and can the Falcons stop a team that's going to want to punch them in the mouth? And then, of course, you have that new coaching narrative between Jim Harbaugh and Raheem Morris. Where are these two teams at in year one under the coaches? That's going to be a fun talking point leading up to that game in Week 13. Then the following week of Week 14, you get the Kirk Cousins homecoming game against Minnesota on the road. The key matchup to me is, again, this is Justin Jefferson, AJ Terrell. AJ Terrell, we'll see if AJ Terrell gets his big contract this summer. I think it will happen. He'll be expected to be able to go up. He's making $19-20 million a year. He'll be expected to be able to, slow down these premier wide receivers in the ways that we were just talking about with Patrick Surtain, potentially with Drake London. But you have the narratives like Kirk going home. You have Pitts versus Hawk, a similar sort of tight end dynamic. How do you utilize a tight end? Or the Vikings, getting all pro production from TJ Hawkinson, or the Falcons getting the same from Kyle Pitts. You get the rookie quarterback dynamic. Again, I don't think we're not supposed to see Penn Hicks at this point in time, but we might be seeing JJ McCarthy at this point in the season. And so that will be an interesting conversation to see how his season is going if Michael Penix at this point in time is still holding the clipboard and, the Vikings are, above 500 on their path to a playoff team or something like that. At this point, it will be an interesting, fun narrative that we can discuss on the pod. Week 15, December 16th, another Monday night football game. Oddly enough, against the Raiders on the road, going to Las Vegas, right? And again, the key matchup here is Max Crosby versus Caleb McGarry. Like Micah Parsons, you're going to have to chip him every snap. How does that impact your game plan if you can't count on the tight ends to be a significant part of your passing game because they have to stay in to chip this pass blocker, right? And, this is why people are sitting here, wanting the Falcons to upgrade the right tackle position. Like, hey, Caleb McGarry, may not be a liability, but he's a problem because it's affecting our game plan too much. And that may be a conversation that we're having next offseason where we're looking at, hey, let's get an upgraded tackle. Week 16, December 22nd, the weekend before Christmas. The NFL's decided they're going to have Christmas Day games on Netflix on like the middle of the week on a Wednesday or something like that, if I'm not mistaken. So this is at home against the Giants, right? You have the Falcons' talented weapons, Drake London, Kyle Pitts. Is the offense humming at this point in time? Going up against a young Giant secondary that's going to, they might have two rookies starting for them or whatever the case may be. Can the Falcons exploit that, right? And then, the narrative is going to be like two teams that have expensive quarterbacks. Is Kirk earning his money at this point? Are the Falcons, sitting here going into, coming out of week 16, I can't do math, right? Like 8-7 or something like that at this point. Who knows, right? And, we'll see if the Giants can get there with Daniel Jones. But, obviously the story about Daniel Jones getting paid is within a year of them paying him, or like a month of them paying them, they began to regret that decision. This is December. Are we having that conversation with Kirk this year? That's going to be a fun narrative to talk about on the podcast. Week 17, another Kirk Cousins homecoming game because the Falcons are going on the road to Washington. Kirk Cousins' first team, right? December 29th. Of course, you got the DQ Raheem Morris matchup, right? Now, Kirk is 2-0 since he's left Washington against the Commanders, right? He had a comeback win in 2022. You'll be facing a rookie quarterback, and that to me is kind of the key matchup, right? How do the Falcons stop a mobile quarterback, particularly like Jaden Daniels, right? Mobile quarterbacks have been a thorn in the Falcons' side these last couple of years. This is where Troy Anderson comes into the picture. This is why we are Team Troy on this podcast and not Team Nate Landman, because we're like, if you're going to be a good defense, you need Troy Anderson to be the guy that can be the X factor that takes out Jaden Daniels, right? Kirk's beaten. He's 2-0 against the Commanders, but beating Taylor Heineke and beating Case Keenum is not the same as beating a weapon like Jaden Daniels. So that's going to be fascinating. Week 18 to wrap up the season. You got a home game January 5th against Carolina. Falcons pass rush going up against a beefed up Panthers interior offensive line. Can Grady Jarrett and David Anya make it look like Carolina wasted a lot of money signing those expensive guards in free agency? That's going to be sort of an interesting key matchup when they face the Panthers. And of course, at this point in time, we'll see which team with the new coach, Raheem Morris or Dave Canales, has gotten the most out of the team, and the Falcons win this game and potentially in the playoffs. So those are all some of the key matchups and narratives that we'll probably be, talking about when we do those crossovers later this season. At this point, those are some things that you guys can look out for. As I've said, I've been, thinking about these matchups for months now. And now that we know the order of it, it's nice to see that. So we'll see what the Falcons do. I'm sure by all means, leave a comment on where you think this record is going to be. Do you feel like this team can exceed that 9.5 win projection over at FanDuel, right? Are you taking the over? You got them at 10-7. You got them at 11-6. Where you guys? Are you taking the under? Do you have them at 9-8, right? That would technically be under, right? So leave those comments by all means. I'm looking forward to seeing all of those guys. Tomorrow's episode, we should be doing our Ruka Roro scouting report breakdown. So you'll get my thoughts on the Falcons' second round pick. We'll talk more about the cornerback position. The Falcons did sign a cornerback today, Anthony Johnson, rather than Jerry Jacobs. And that will sort of inform the competition at that cornerback spot, that CB2 spot opposite AJ Terrell. So we'll definitely get into that next week as well. And so that is going to do it for us, guys. I really appreciate you all for tuning in. Check out Locked On Sports today, Locked On NFL. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.